In May 1949, the State Department conveyed a strong message to the Israeli government that it considered the repatriation of the refugees as a precondition for peace. When the Israeli rejection arrived, the US administration threatened Israel with sanctions and withheld a promised loan. In response, the Israelis at first suggested taking in 75,000 refugees and allowing the reunification of families for another 25,000. When this was deemed insufficient by Washington, the government suggested taking in the Gaza Strip, with its 90,000 indigenous inhabitants and its refugee community of 200,000. Both proposals seemed niggardly, but by then, the spring of 1949, a personnel reshuffle in the American State Department reoriented America's Palestine policy onto a different course that completely sidelined, if not altogether ignored, the refugee question. During this short lived period of US pressure, April May 1949, Ben Gurion's basic response was to intensify the settlement of Jewish immigrants on the confiscated land and in the evicted houses. When Sharet and Kaplan objected, apprehensive of international condemnation of such acts, Ben Gurion again appointed a more cabal-like body that soon encouraged hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants from Europe and the Arab world to seize the Palestinian homes left in the towns and cities and to build settlements on the ruins of the expelled villages. The appropriation of Palestinian property was supposed to follow a systematic national program, but by the end of September, Ben Gurion gave up the idea of an orderly takeover in the major cities such as Jaffa, Jerusalem, and Haifa. Similarly, it proved impossible to coordinate the onslaught of covetous farmers and governmental agencies on the dispossessed villages and lands. The distribution of land was the responsibility of the Jewish National Fund. After the 1948 war, other bodies were given similar authority, the most important of which was the custodian mentioned. The JNF found it had to compete for the job of principal divider of the spoils of war. In the final analysis, the JNF came out on top, but it took time. All in all, Israel had taken over 3.5 million dunam of land in rural Palestine. This estimate from 1948 included all houses and fields of the destroyed villages. It took a while before a clear centralized policy emerged of how best to use this land. Ben Gurion deferred a total takeover by private or public Jewish agencies while the UN was still discussing the fate of the refugees, first in Lausanne in 1949 and after that in a series of futile committees set up to deal with the refugee issue. He knew that in the wake of the UN General Assembly's Resolution 194, 11 December 1948, which demanded the unconditional repatriation of all Palestinian refugees, a formal and legal Israeli takeover would cause problems. In order to forestall international indignation over collective dispossession, the Israeli government appointed a custodian for the newly acquired properties pending a final decision over their fate. Typical of previous Zionist conduct, this pragmatic solution became policy until a strategic decision would follow to change it, i.e., by redefining the status of the dispossessed assets. The custodian was thus a function the Israeli government created in order to fend off any possible fallout from UN Resolution 194 that insisted that all refugees be allowed to return and or be compensated. By putting all private and collective possessions of the expelled Palestinians under its custody, the government could, and in effect did, sell these properties to public and private Jewish groups and individuals later under the spurious pretext that no claimants had come forward. Moreover, the moment the confiscated lands from Palestinian owners were put under government custodianship, they became state lands, which by law belonged to the Jewish nation, which in turn meant that none of it could be sold to Arabs. This legal sleight of hand meant that as long as no final strategic decision on how to divide the lands had been made, tactical interim resolutions could be adopted in order to hand over part of the lands to the IDF, for instance, or to new immigrants, or at cheap rates to the kibbutzim movements. The JNF faced fierce competition from all these clients in the scramble over the spoils. It did well to begin with, and bought up almost every destroyed village together with all its houses and lands. The custodian had sold 1 million dunam out of the total 3.5 million directly to the JNF at a bargain price in December 1948. Another quarter of a million was passed on to the JNF in 1949. Then lack of funds put a halt to the JNF's seemingly insatiable greed, and what the JNF failed to purchase, the three kibbutzim movement, the Mosavim movement, and private real estate dealers were happy to divide among themselves. The most avaricious of these proved to be the leftist kibbutz movement Hasomer HaJair that belonged to Mapam, the party to the left of Mapai, Israel's ruling party. Hasomer HaJair members were not content only with lands from which the people had already been expelled, but also wanted the lands whose Palestinian owners had survived the onslaught and who were still clinging on to them. Consequently, they now wanted these people to be driven out too, even though the official ethnic cleansing had come to an end. All these contenders had to make way for the Israeli army's demands to have large tracts of land set aside as training grounds and camps. And yet, by 1950, half of the dispossessed rural lands were still in the hands of the JNF. In the first week of January 1949, Jewish settlers colonized the villages of Kuyaikat, Ras al Nakura, Birwa, Safsaf, Shasa, and Lajun. On the lands of other villages, such as Malul and Jalama in the north, the IDF built military bases. In many ways, the new settlements did not look much different from the army bases. New fortified bastions where once villagers had led their pastoral and agricultural lives. The human geography of Palestine as a whole was forcibly transformed. The Arab character of the cities was effaced from the destruction of large sections, including the spacious park in Jaffa and community centers in Jerusalem. This transformation was driven by the desire to wipe out one nation's history and culture and replace it with a fabricated version of another, from which all traces of the indigenous population was elided.